December 21st, 1945, Washington, D.C. The phone rang in Dwight D. Eisenhower's office. He already knew what it meant. George S. Patton was dead. For 3 years, Eisenhower had walked a narrow, exhausting line. Publicly, he disciplined his most controversial general. Privately, he depended on him to win battles no one else could. He defended Patton to politicians, apologized for him to allies, restrained him when his aggression threatened to explode into diplomatic disaster. Patton was brilliant. Patton was dangerous. Patton was indispensable. And now, Patton was gone. For the first time since the war began, Eisenhower didn't have to choose his words carefully. And what he finally admitted, quietly, privately, without witnesses, revealed a truth he had buried under years of political necessity. Patton wasn't just a good general. He was the weapon Eisenhower used when everything else failed, and losing him felt like losing the war's sharpest blade after the war was already won. But that truth didn't begin in Europe. It began decades earlier, with 2 young officers, a tank engine torn apart on the floor, and an idea the U.S. Army didn't want to hear. Camp Meade, 1919. Long before there was a supreme commander of Allied forces, long before there was the most feared general in the American Army, there were just 2 captains, sleeves rolled up, hands black with grease, standing over a tank engine pulled apart on the floor. Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton. They spent hours like this, tearing engines down, arguing over tactics, sketching ideas that barely fit inside the doctrine of the U.S. Army at the time. To them, tanks were not slow-moving support weapons. They were the future. Fast, mobile, decisive. Used correctly, they could break an enemy before he understood what was happening. The Army didn't agree. Senior officers dismissed their ideas as reckless. Infantry still ruled doctrine. Cavalry officers clung to horses. Tanks were supposed to follow, not lead. When Eisenhower and Patton kept pushing, they were warned. Careers could be ruined. This is where their paths subtly diverged. Patton came from wealth, old family money, prestige, confidence bordering on arrogance. He had already seen combat in Mexico and France. If the Army wanted to threaten him, he could afford to push back. Eisenhower couldn't. He was a Kansas farm boy. He had missed combat in World War I. He needed his paycheck. So Eisenhower learned something Patton never did: when to stay quiet. Patton kept arguing loudly. Eisenhower learned to argue carefully, but they never lost their connection. They shared the same vision. They just learned different survival skills. 23 years later, 23 years passed. Those 2 captains became something else entirely. One was now Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, responsible not just for winning battles, but for holding together an alliance of nations with competing egos, politics, and priorities. The other was the most aggressive, unpredictable, and feared American general in the war. The friendship remained, but everything else had changed. Eisenhower no longer debated Patton as an equal. He managed him. He had to decide when to unleash Patton and when to restrain him, when to defend him to Roosevelt and Marshall, when to apologize for him to Churchill and the British. Patton hated this. He believed Eisenhower had become too political, too cautious, too concerned with diplomacy and coalition building. Patton wanted to fight wars, not negotiate them. The tension between them simmered beneath every interaction. 2 men who once dreamed together, now locked in a relationship where one held the power to decide whether the other would be allowed to do what he did best. August 1943, Sicily. Patton was commanding the 7th Army during the invasion of Italy. He visited field hospitals. There he encountered soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD, then known as combat fatigue or shell shock. Patton didn't see trauma. He saw weakness. In 2 separate incidents, he slapped soldiers, called them cowards, threatened to shoot them. Word spread fast. Journalists picked it up. Politicians demanded answers. The American public was outraged, and Eisenhower faced an impossible decision: fire Patton and lose the most effective combat commander he had, or keep him and risk a political firestorm that could destabilize the entire Allied command. Eisenhower chose the narrowest path between disaster and necessity. He issued a formal reprimand, ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers, the medical staff, and his entire army, public enough to satisfy critics, not enough to end Patton's career, because Eisenhower already knew something. He was planning Operation Overlord, and he didn't just want Patton for it. He needed him. Eisenhower never said it out loud. He couldn't. But in Sicily, Patton had proven something Eisenhower already suspected, something no report or committee could ignore. Patton moved faster than anyone else. He struck harder, and he broke the enemy's morale in ways other commanders simply didn't. While Montgomery's British forces advanced carefully, methodically, Patton's 7th Army raced across Sicily. German units never knew where he would appear next. Defensive lines collapsed before they were fully formed. The Germans learned to fear one thing above all else: speed. Eisenhower saw it clearly. So when Washington demanded Patton's removal, Eisenhower did something extraordinary. He saved Patton's career, not because Patton deserved forgiveness, but because the war demanded results, and saving Patton came at a price. Eisenhower had to justify the decision to George Marshall, to President Roosevelt, to the War Department. He had to promise Patton would be controlled, that the behavior would never happen again, that the military advantage outweighed the political damage. And here was the truth Eisenhower could never say publicly. He wasn't entirely sure Patton was wrong. In private conversations with his staff, Eisenhower admitted frustration with soldiers who collapsed under pressure. He didn't condone Patton's actions, but he understood the instinct behind them. War required endurance, mental toughness, men who didn't break. Patton's method was unacceptable, but his belief that armies needed discipline stronger than fear wasn't completely off base. Eisenhower just couldn't say that in public, so he played both roles. He punished Patton for the world to see and protected him where no one else could. As D-Day approached, Eisenhower faced a problem more dangerous than German divisions: convincing the enemy where the invasion would land. The solution became Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate deception campaign of the war. Fake radio traffic, fake bases, inflatable tanks, plywood landing craft, and at the center of it all, George Patton. German intelligence believed Patton was the Allies' most dangerous commander. They studied his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. They knew his reputation, so Eisenhower used that fear. He placed Patton in command of the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly preparing to invade Calais. Patton inspected fake units, gave speeches, was photographed by German reconnaissance aircraft. And the Germans believed every word of it. Even weeks after D-Day, major German forces remained pinned near Calais, waiting for Patton's real invasion. It worked perfectly, and it drove Patton insane. Patton wanted to be on the beaches of Normandy. He wanted combat, glory, command. Instead, he was playing an actor in a war theater, commanding an army that didn't exist. Eisenhower couldn't tell him the truth, that Patton's reputation was saving Allied lives, that his absence from Normandy was strategic, not personal, that in those early weeks, Patton was more valuable as a ghost than as a general. Patton only learned the full scope of Operation Fortitude after the war, and even then, he resented it. But Eisenhower never doubted the decision. He had used Patton's greatest strength, fear, to win a battle before it was even fought. And soon, Patton would finally be unleashed. August 1st, 1944. After months of waiting, Patton's Third Army finally went operational in France. What followed stunned everyone, including Eisenhower. In a single month, the Third Army advanced farther than any comparable force in modern military history. Town after town fell. German units were destroyed or captured faster than they could retreat. Defensive lines didn't collapse. They were never allowed to form. Patton didn't maneuver around the enemy. He ran straight through them. German commanders reported the same problem again and again. They could not predict him, slow him, or regroup in time. Eisenhower watched with pride and growing anxiety because Patton was proving everything they had argued about back in 1919. Mobile warfare worked, speed broke armies, but Patton was moving so fast he was outrunning his supply lines. Fuel shortages, ammunition bottlenecks, coordination problems with neighboring Allied armies. Other commanders couldn't keep up. Omar Bradley advanced carefully, consolidating gains. Bernard Montgomery was even slower, refusing to attack until every detail was perfect. Patton did none of that. He called Eisenhower's headquarters constantly. "Give me the fuel," he said. "I'll be in Berlin in 2 weeks." Eisenhower knew it wasn't that simple. Supplies were finite. Other armies needed fuel too. The British demanded priority, and there were agreements with the Soviets, occupation zones, post-war borders, political promises already made. Patton didn't care. He saw the German army collapsing. Every delay felt criminal. Every pause felt like letting the enemy breathe. Privately, Eisenhower sometimes agreed. In conversations with his chief of staff, Bedell Smith, Eisenhower admitted Patton might be right, that caution and politics were interfering with military logic. But Eisenhower wasn't just a general. He was managing an alliance, American interests, British pride, Soviet expectations. He had to think beyond the next battle, to the world that would exist after the war ended. So Eisenhower slowed Patton down. He diverted fuel to Montgomery for Operation Market Garden. It failed spectacularly, and Patton was furious. He believed Eisenhower had squandered the best chance to end the war early. Their relationship, already strained, turned openly hostile at times. Two men who needed each other, and increasingly couldn't stand each other. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack, the Battle of the Bulge. American lines collapsed. Entire units were surrounded. For the first time since D-Day, it looked like the Allies might actually lose ground. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun. The mood was grim. Bradley looked shaken. Montgomery urged caution. Other commanders spoke of defensive lines and waiting for reinforcements. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George," he asked, "how long will it take you to attack?" Everyone understood what he was asking. Patton's Third Army was facing south, 90 degrees away from the Bulge. To respond, he would have to disengage completely, pivot his entire force, and attack through winter weather into the German flank. Most generals would need weeks. Patton reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small notebook. He had already wargamed this scenario on the train ride to Verdun. He looked up. "December 22nd, he said. 3 divisions, 72 hours. The room went silent. Most of the generals thought it was impossible. But Eisenhower knew Patton well enough to recognize the truth. He wasn't bluffing. "Make it so," Eisenhower said. Patton didn't hesitate. The moment he left Eisenhower's headquarters at Verdun, the Third Army began to move. Orders went out in every direction. Units disengaged under pressure. Columns pivoted in the snow. Engines roared to life in sub-zero temperatures. It was one of the most complex maneuvers ever attempted in the middle of an active battle. 3 divisions, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks and vehicles, all turning 90 degrees in winter under enemy pressure. Most commanders would have needed weeks just to plan it. Patton had already done the planning. On December 22, 1944, exactly when he promised, Patton's Third Army slammed into the southern flank of the German advance. The impact was immediate. German momentum stalled. Their spearheads were cut off. What had been a terrifying Allied crisis began to collapse into confusion. The Battle of the Bulge, once on the verge of disaster, turned into an Allied victory. Eisenhower watched the reports come in, and in that moment, every difficult decision he had made about Patton finally made sense. All the public reprimands, all the political headaches, all the times he had defended Patton behind closed doors while restraining him in public. It had all been worth it, because when everything was falling apart, when no one else could move fast enough, Eisenhower turned to Patton, and Patton delivered. During the war, Eisenhower's public statements about Patton were always careful, respectful, measured, never excessive. He couldn't show favoritism. He commanded an alliance, not just an American army. He had to keep Montgomery cooperative, keep Bradley confident, maintain morale across dozens of commands. Calling Patton irreplaceable in public would have been a diplomatic disaster. But privately, Eisenhower knew the truth. In staff meetings, when discussing difficult operations, Eisenhower would sometimes ask a simple question: what would Patton do? Not because Patton was always right, but because Patton thought differently than everyone else. Where others saw obstacles, Patton saw openings. Where others calculated risk, Patton calculated speed. Eisenhower's diaries from 1944 and 1945 reveal the contradiction that defined his command. He needed Patton's aggression, but he had to restrain it. He valued Patton's results, but he had to apologize for Patton's behavior. He relied on Patton in crisis, but he could never admit it publicly. Peace changed everything. Patton's blunt personality, his public comments about former Nazis, and his calls to confront the Soviets immediately became politically toxic. The very traits that made him unbeatable in war made him dangerous in peace. Eisenhower had no choice. He removed Patton from command. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life, demoting his old friend, the man who had saved the day in the Ardennes, the general who had proven every theory they had once sketched together in 1919. Their final conversations were bitter. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt trapped. Then came the accident. 12 days later, George S. Patton was dead. After Patton's death, Eisenhower's carefully maintained diplomatic mask cracked. In private letters, in quiet conversations with staff, in moments recorded only by those closest to him. Eisenhower spoke with a raw honesty he had never allowed himself during the war. He admitted that Patton achieved results through sheer speed, pressure, and force of will, qualities that couldn't be taught or replaced. Other generals commanded through planning and organization. Patton commanded through willpower. Eisenhower confessed that restraining Patton had been necessary for political reasons, not military ones, that some of his decisions to hold Patton back haunted him, that maybe, just maybe, if he had given Patton more freedom, the war might have ended sooner. And then Eisenhower said something that revealed the core of their relationship. Managing Patton had been the hardest part of his command, and the most important, because Patton needed management. Left unchecked, he would have caused diplomatic chaos, but properly directed, he was unstoppable. Years after the war, Dwight D. Eisenhower finally put the truth into words. In his memoirs, written long after the guns had fallen silent, Eisenhower described George S. Patton with a word he had never dared to use during the war. Indispensable. It was an extraordinary admission. Indispensable doesn't mean talented. It doesn't mean effective. It means irreplaceable, that the outcome would have been different without him. Eisenhower explained what he could never say publicly while the war was being fought. Patton was uniquely suited for war. He thrived in chaos. He thrived when information was incomplete and decisions had to be made instantly. Where other commanders hesitated, Patton accelerated. Where others waited for clarity, Patton created momentum. Other generals relied on planning, structure, and careful coordination. Patton relied on willpower. That difference mattered most when everything was going wrong. When the front collapsed in the Ardennes, when Allied forces were surrounded, when delay meant disaster. That was when Eisenhower turned to Patton, and Patton delivered. Eisenhower never romanticized Patton. He didn't excuse his behavior. He didn't deny the damage Patton sometimes caused. Instead, he acknowledged a harder truth. Some people are built for very specific moments in history. Patton was built for speed, for aggression, for relentless pressure. In peacetime, those qualities became liabilities. In war, they became decisive. Eisenhower understood that managing Patton meant accepting constant risk. Left unchecked, Patton could have created diplomatic disasters and political chaos. But properly directed, given boundaries, targets, and a mission, he was the most powerful weapon Eisenhower had. That balance between restraint and release was the burden Eisenhower carried throughout the war. Eisenhower's final admission wasn't really about Patton. It was about leadership, about the loneliness of command, about having to restrain the very people you depend on most, about choosing what is politically acceptable over what is militarily ideal. Eisenhower had to protect Patton from himself, from politicians, from allies, and sometimes from the consequences of his own brilliance. Only after Patton was gone could Eisenhower admit how much that balancing act had cost him, and how much it had been worth it. On December 21st, 1945, America didn't just lose a general. It lost someone who could make impossible things happen through sheer force of will. Someone who could move an army when others were still writing orders. someone who thrived when everything was falling apart. Eisenhower had always known it. But only after Patton died could he finally say it, without consequences. George S. Patton was not easy, he was not safe, he was not manageable in peace. But in war, he was indispensable.